My goal in this video is to convince you that multiband compression is better than EQ, but don't get it twisted. EQ will always have a place in the toolkit when it comes to mixing. But what I'm really trying to do is make you more aware of multiband compression and, more importantly, get you to use it more in your mixes, because I think that you'll actually achieve better results using it instead of an EQ. Unlike regular compression, which is focused on the entire frequency spectrum, multiband compression allows you to focus on a specific frequency band and compress that uniquely from one another. Perhaps I want to just affect the low end without affecting the highs or the mids. I can compress just the low end using a multiband compressor without affecting those other bands that I don't want to manipulate. This is specifically great at treating frequency imbalances on a sound, and much more so than using a traditional EQ. This is because it's a dynamic process, meaning that it isn't happening the entire time, but rather only when the signal is loud enough to pass a threshold and turn that compressor on. Once it does, the multiband compressor engages and effectively reduces the presence of this frequency area, which ultimately helps clean up the sound that you're applying it to. I would even argue that multiband compression is one of my desert island plugins. That means if you gave me a multiband compressor and perhaps a set of filters, I could effectively mix just as good as I do right now with much less in the arsenal. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your boy 5 Piece, producer and engineer extraordinaire. If you're new here and looking to learn more about mixing, mastering, and how to make money with your music, please consider subscribing to the channel. I post a video just like this every single week, always focused on helping you sound better and helping you make more money with your music. But in today's video, we're talking all about multi-band compression, so let's get right into the content. When we reach for an EQ, we're generally using it to do two things. First, we're cutting. We're trying to reduce the presence of a specific frequency, generally some sort of problem, to hopefully sculpt the sound and make it sound cleaner, clearer, or just better in some sort of way. Or we're doing the opposite. We are boosting, we're exaggerating or enhancing a specific frequency to give it a little bit more presence in a certain area, and that might help color the sound or shape the tone in some sort of way. Now, what's interesting is I can actually use a multi-band compressor to do this exact same thing, at least the exact same thing as a static EQ. If I create this band here and I reset the range to 0, there's effectively going to be no compression taking place, and I can use the makeup gain to either add or even subtract from a specific frequency area and basically create the exact same effect that you would get by using a static EQ, except we're going to have a few more potential options here. Now, of course, I wouldn't actually use the multiband compressor this way because it's not actually utilizing compression at all, and that is the benefit to using it. Instead, I'm just doing this to show you that you could really use a multiband compressor to mirror or replicate a static EQ and even give you some more potential options that the static EQ cannot. But as you may recall from the intro, multiband compression is a dynamic process. If you apply it to a frequency band, you can set it up to compress or reduce the presence of a specific frequency only when it's loud enough to pass the threshold. I have a static band here reducing 89 Hz on this vocal by 3 dB, and I also have a multi-band focused on that same exact area, 89 Hz, and just reducing this more dynamically, only when that signal is passing the threshold. So I'm going to play this example, which is a fairly muddy vocal in my opinion, and we're ultimately going to shoot these out back and forth and listen for the static versus the multi-band compressor.
I don't know what to say, just pass the J up on the left side. These days these people talk, they quick to tell you what's on their mind. Problem is I don't care, what's mine is yours, I share it all. And I can't call it, but ain't stopping till I got it all.
You can ultimately hear there's a little bit more low-end presence with the static EQ, and that static EQ also just sounds a little bit more rigid. It's not so floaty or doesn't have a lot of movement as the Pro MB, the multi-band compressor, does in this example. Now, you might be wondering, what about dynamic EQ? That's also a dynamic process, right? Wouldn't that be the same as multi-band compression? Yes and no. Dynamic EQ, as you may remember from my previous video on this subject, only works when the signal is loud enough to pass a preset threshold. That's what you see here. Once a signal is loud enough to pass this threshold, that's when this dynamic EQ is going to kick in and actually begin to reduce. That's obviously way different from a static band, which is just going to be always reducing or always increasing a specific band consistently. Now, this is going to lead to a similar result to multi-band compression, but ultimately it is still different. This is because the multiband compressor ultimately provides way more control over the parameters of a band that the dynamic EQ usually does not. Let's take a look at this dynamic EQ, for example. It only gives you access to a handful of parameters. You have frequency select, a gain that you can add or remove, the range itself, so how much maximum volume you can lose at any given moment, the Q, how wide it is, and then the threshold. However, if we look at the multiband compressor, you have access to the threshold once again, but also the range. You have an attack and release. These are really key parameters here that give you a lot more control over the sound, an output gain, a ratio, a knee, a look ahead, and several other features that ultimately that Pro Q is lacking. Now, keep in mind, not every dynamic EQ lacks in these features. Some of them actually do have access to these parameters, but you can consistently expect a multiband compressor to have access to them, whereas not every dynamic EQ will. So this ultimately leads me to the main reasons why multiband compression is better than both static and dynamic EQ. The first reason being it's transparent. Because it's dynamic, it's not affecting a signal the entire time, but rather only when it's loud enough to be affected. A dynamic EQ also wins in this category technically, but it falls short to multiband compression because of the second reason that I'm about to say, which is that a multiband compressor is more flexible. It provides more control over a frequency band than static or dynamic EQ by providing controls such as attack, release, ratio, knee, look ahead, and more. This is stuff we've already discussed, but that means you can ultimately dial in a sound and make it less noticeable, more transparent, and overall just more malleable in comparison to a dynamic EQ, which is the closest competition in this race. With that in mind, let's now compare dynamic EQ and multiband compression. I have both of these set up in a similar way, affecting the similar kind of range, and let's see how different each of these sounds.
I don't know what to say, just pass the J up on the left side. These days these people talk, they quick to tell you what's on their mind. Problem is I don't care, what's mine is yours, I share it all. And I can't call it, but ain't stopping till I got it all.
Now, while they are similar here, I find that the multiband compressor sounds just a touch bit more natural. And of course, it's going to provide us with way more opportunities to just control and shape or sculpt the sound or sculpt the compression and the reduction taking place. Now, so far, I've been talking about reducing the presence of certain frequencies and how multiband compression has been better suited at that so far. But what if you want to add? What if you want to boost frequencies or enhance frequency content using a multiband compressor? Is that a better move than an EQ? I think multiband compression is really well suited to this, and I'm actually going to skip over a traditional method of adding gain, which is basically when you compress a signal, most of the time you're going to add some sort of output or makeup gain to compensate for whatever you're losing. And I've talked about this at great length. If you haven't watched my other video, how to compress vocals, definitely check that out because I talk about it. I'll leave a link to it up above right now and in the description below. What I do want to focus on instead is a much more effective way to enhance frequency content using a multiband, and that is with something called upward compression. Unlike regular compression, which first works at reducing a signal and then adding volume back to compensate for it, we're actually going to do things in the reverse order. Upward compression actually starts by boosting the signal. So in this case, I have a positive range. This is adding volume to the signal first. And what that does is it completely enhances whatever I'm affecting, but then the way that it works with compression is, while it is being boosted, anything that is still too loud enough to pass a threshold that we're going to set, once again, which you see here, it's going to actually reduce that. So those parts are not going to get boosted, but anything that is not loud enough to pass the threshold will. And there's a few benefits to doing it this way. The first one is it's obviously going to enhance the frequency content, just like you would with a static EQ move. The second benefit is that it usually creates movement. This is because you're obviously adding to that sound, but then whenever that sound is too loud and passes the threshold, it's going to move it down. That's going to ultimately create some movement and fluctuations in volume, and that ultimately allows it to be perceived as moving more or just enhancing the impact of whatever you are affecting. I suppose there is a third benefit with this too, and that is that the multiband compressor will help you avoid increasing problems. So for example, if you were to just take a static EQ and just boost the high end, okay, you might be able to get some more of that air and clarity and all that, all the good stuff that you want, but you might also increase the presence of harshness and brittleness. So that actually is a negative thing that you want to avoid. You don't want to create more problems problems by boosting. And that's why the multiband might actually be a better solution, because you can ultimately enhance this area, but because you can set a threshold and also reduce it back to 0 or unity in this case, you can ultimately set it in a way where whenever a harsh problem is poking its head out, or maybe too much brittleness is coming through, you can ultimately have it reduce and not create that problem, but still add that benefit of boosting. Let's actually shoot these two out. I got the multiband and I got the Pro Q. Let's actually go back and forth and play each of them and just see how they sound, how different they sound. And remember, they are affecting roughly the same area, adding roughly about 1 dB consistently. So that's how I've set them up. Let's check this out.
I don't know what to say, just pass the J up on the left side. These days these people talk, they quick to tell you what's on their mind. Problem is I don't care, what's mine is yours, I share it all. And I can't call it, but ain't stopping till I got it all. I don't know what to say, just pass the J up on the left side. These days these people talk, they quick to tell you what's on their mind. Problem is I don't care, what's mine is yours, I share it all. And I can't call it, but ain't stopping till I got it all.
So I think the biggest difference here is that movement that I was talking about. You could really hear the band actually working and moving and just creating a little bit of a dynamic difference at times with the multiband. Whereas with the EQ, it just sounded very rigid. You could definitely hear that that boost was there. You could hear it clearly, but of course it's happening the entire time. And it's not really a big deal in this case, but depending on what track you are affecting, that EQ could create some of those problems that I mentioned before. Now I sped through this upward compression stuff, but I do think it's a very important topic that a lot of people don't talk about. And if you're somebody who is not as familiar with upward compression, I 100% recommend that you check out my video, how to use upward compression. I'll leave a link to it up above and in the description below, but definitely check that out because it's very helpful and will not only help you with boosting and enhancing individual tracks, but other things such as masters. I love using on my masters, for example, to increase the perceived loudness of a track, and I think that you'll get a lot of value if you check that video out. So are you going to be reaching for a multi-band compressor over an EQ on your next mix? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you guys. And if you haven't hit that thumbs up button, definitely tap that right now for the YouTube algorithm. And of course, if you're new here and you still haven't subscribed, I hope this video was helpful enough and convinced you to press that subscribe button so you can see these future videos once they go live. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace.
5,